Right. So I'm going to pick up last week. I've got some gaps I'm going to fill in too during the review. As usual, we are going to have some new material in the review. And I'll bring it up when I get there, but it's largely just because I learned some new information this week and I thought this is pertinent to Sunday school, so I'm going to include it. So last week we kind of went through a survey of Henry VIII's wives because they're so important to the story of how we got our Bible. And you don't realize how important they are to the story of how you got your Bible unless you go through the history of them. So we started with Catherine of Aragon, his first wife. We talked about when Henry was 19, he inherited the throne. Catherine was Henry's brother's wife initially, but his older brother Arthur had died, and Catherine was of royal lineage. And I didn't specify, but it would actually make sense if I told you where she was from. She was from Spain, which makes sense when we talked about Charles V, because Charles V is her nephew and he's king of Spain. So Catherine of Aragon is of royal lineage. They want her to be the queen, but because she married Arthur, it was illegal for Henry to marry Catherine. But Arthur had been sick for the 5 months that they had been married, and so they went to the Pope to ask for a special exemption to basically bypass the law and let Henry marry Catherine of Aragon. The Pope asked if Catherine and Arthur had ever consummated the marriage. She said no, because he was sick and they'd only been married for 5 months. That never occurred. And the Pope said, because of that, I will give you a special exemption and you can marry Henry. So he gets his first wife, she gets his first wife, Catherine. And Henry, his primary focus is with his wives is to get a male heir. This is very important to him. Catherine does eventually produce a male heir, Prince Henry, and he was born in January of 1511, but he didn't make it past infancy. He died the next month. And she had several other miscarriages, and then she produced a daughter who survived infancy. Because of his frustration with Catherine, and he was a bit of a whoremonger himself, he had many mistresses, but one mistress in particular was Lady Elizabeth Blount. She and him had an affair, and Blount ends up pregnant. Blount ends up giving birth to Henry Fitzroy. Henry Fitzroy is the only illegitimate son Henry has recognized, or actually only illegitimate child Henry has recognized. Back then, if he had a mistress and the mistress got pregnant and she gave birth and she said it's Henry's kid and he says no, it's not, then it's not his. So this was the first one where he was like, yeah, that one is mine. So it's the only recorded illegitimate recognized child of Henry's. Obviously, that relationship puts a massive divide between him and his actual wife. And Henry begins to think that it's actually not him that's the problem. The problem is Catherine. He's trying to get a male heir, and he ends up with a mistress, but he can't have one with his wife. And so he begins to think that actually Catherine lied to him and the Pope about consummating the marriage. And so he asks his cardinal, Wolsey. Cardinal Wolsey is the most powerful man in England at the time, aside from the king, to annul their marriage. And Wolsey says, I can't annul your marriage because the Pope gave you a special dispensation and only the Pope can overturn that. So he says, go to the Pope, ask for ask him to overturn his special dispensation for the marriage because he had been lied to. And he bases his evidence of the lie on Leviticus 20:21, which says, if a man marries his brother's wife, it is impurity. He has violated the intimacy that belongs to his brother. They will be childless. So Henry says they must have consummated the marriage. That's why I'm childless. Pushback kept coming back as, you're not childless, though. You have a daughter. And he says, I don't really care. I don't have a son. Therefore, I might as well be childless. So Wolsey attempts to do what the king said. He goes to the Pope to ask the Pope to overturn his special dispensation. But the Pope had just recently been attacked by Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, because Charles V looked at the direction of the church and didn't feel it aligned with his own interests. So he went to Rome, sacked it, in order to cause the Pope to rethink the direction of the church to be more in line with the Holy Roman Emperor's likings. And so when Wolsey shows up to get the special dispensation annulled from the Pope, he is under Charles V's thumb. Charles V is the nephew of Catherine. Catherine does not want a divorce or an annulment. She wants to stay queen. It's a lot of power in that. And so she wants to stay queen. And this is in Holy Roman Emperor Charles V's best interest, because if something should happen to Henry, England now has his aunt on the throne. So the Pope says, no, you can't have a divorce or an annulment. It's an annulment. And so that upsets Henry. And so Henry finds a new love interest. Her name is Anne Boleyn. And he secretly marries her. And during that time, he has two wives. He has Anne Boleyn as his wife, and he has Catherine as his wife. The marriage is put into question because it's secret. It's against the law to have a second wife. So they're questioning the authenticity of the marriage, whether or not it's something that even can be recognized. And while that debate is happening, the great matter begins. And the great matter, or I should say the great matter begins when he asks for the annulment. But what Henry does is he signs the Act of Supremacy, and he severs his ties with the Pope, and he says the Pope is not over the Church of England, I am, and therefore I don't need his permission for the annulment. I can annul my own marriage myself. And so he does, and that affirms his marriage with the new Queen of England, Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn suffers the same issues as Catherine, though. She has a hard time producing a male heir, as if she has any control over the matter herself. And after a couple of years of their marriage, I forget what year, I didn't write the year down. Actually, I can see, I think it's 1536. In 1536, I mentioned this last time, that Henry VIII was super athletic, right? He loved sports. He loved games. He loved hunting. He was, as I learned, he was about 6'2", and he was broad. He was a strong man. He was attractive, and he put himself in risky situations, one of them being jousting. He loved to joust. It was one of his favorite sports because of its inherent danger. So he's a bit of a thrill seeker, and in one particular match where he's jousting, he has an accident in which he's knocked off his horse and his horse falls on top of him. This knocks him out for a few hours. The doctors think he's not going to pull out of it. And he also gets a massive wound in his thigh that never heals. And that actually becomes kind of important that I learned this week. So because of that, he faces his imminent mortality. He has an illegitimate son, but he does not have a legitimate son. He's seen that this could end his dynasty if he doesn't get a male heir. And because Catherine, not only is she not producing a male heir, but she's also favorable to the Protestant Reformation, having her own works of Tyndale, having her own works of Luther. And Henry hates Tyndale, and he's not a fan of Luther. So that becomes a problem for Anne. And we talked about that. Anne ends up being executed for treason and a whole bunch of other charges they trumped up on her. And so Anne Boleyn is executed. Just a few months after Anne Boleyn is executed, his illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy that we talked about, he dies at the age of 16. So now Henry has no male heir whatsoever. And so we paused there on his wives because we wanted to talk about the impact the Reformation was having on other people around Henry VIII. And we talked about Archbishop Thomas Cranmer before. We talked about Cromwell as well. And Cranmer and Cromwell were the reasons we got the Matthew's Bible. I don't have the Great Bible up there on this slide, but we have the Matthew's Bible. Rogers puts together the Matthew Bibles and the Matthew Bible, and that Bible gets licensed for the King of England, for the Church of England to be used in their services. It's the first legal English Bible. That is done by these three men, and Cranmer, particularly, Cromwell as well, but Cranmer particularly is being very heavily influenced by the Protestant Reformation. And so he's trying to move the king gently into that direction. And as he continues to do that, they get that Matthew's Bible licensed. I should have just clicked forward instead of backwards. They get that Matthew Bible licensed. And then Cranmer starts what is called the litany. The litany is structured prayers. This is going to start replacing the Latin liturgy that's taking place in the English church. So you had an English Bible, but you still had Latin liturgy. So your church services were bilingual. And most of the people didn't understand Latin, but they understood their English Bible. He starts his litany by structured prayers and things of that nature. And when he quotes scripture, at this point, he's quoting it from the Matthew's Bible. And then we get the Great Bible, which is a few years later, which is Coverdale does the update. We talked about him. Coverdale's going to be important for us again. But he does the update. He gives us the Great Bible. And that Bible becomes the new Bible that Cranmer starts to use to quote in his litany. So now he's got Matthew Bible quotes and Great Bible quotes in the same work. All right. During that time, we'll skip back to the Queen. This is the Queens. We got the next Queen. This would be Henry's third Queen, Jane Seymour. Jane Seymour is favorable towards the Reformation. She comes off as moderate because her family is very favorable to the Reformation, but she herself has to be more moderate being in the king's presence. So she takes a more moderate path, just like Cranmer does. Cranmer really holds back a lot of what he believes in order not to upset the king. And Queen Jane Seymour was able to do something the previous two wives were unable to do, and she gives a male heir, Prince Edward VI. Prince Edward VI is born, but 12 days later, Jane Seymour dies. And so the king, again, is without a wife. And so, all right. And then here, the Church of England has the Great Bible now. And then we get the Taverner's Bible, which was not an authorized Bible. And we talked about that in a previous class. And Cranmer's still doing his work. So now we have English Bibles in the church service. You're getting minimal amounts of English liturgy, thanks to Cranmer. But now Henry is without a wife. And so Henry needs a new wife. Henry asked Cromwell to find a wife. We talked about Anne of Cleves last week, and this is where that wound starts to take place a little bit. That wound in his thigh that was never healing, and he was a very athletic man. I meant to look this up, but he was a very athletic man. But he became relatively immobile after that accident. And so you got a man who was very active physically, eating a lot. And now he's immobile. And so around this time in history, Henry goes up to about 400 pounds. About 400 pounds. And so when Cromwell says, I have a wife for you, but you haven't met her, she hasn't met you, he commissions a painter to come in. We talked about this last week. A painter to come in to paint a picture of Anne of Cleves so Henry can see her. It's a very flattering picture. And Henry says, I like her. Get her for me. We'll have the marriage. When Anne of Cleves shows up, we talked about this last week, she doesn't match her painting very well. and he marries her and then immediately annuls the marriage. I was listening to one historian today who actually put the shoe on the other foot. Instead of suggesting Anne of Cleves was unattractive, he suggested that Anne of Cleves was unattracted to him, and therefore he made up that she was unattractive because he felt offended and annulled the marriage. That is also a total possibility. What's also interesting is that the same painting I have up there of Henry VIII is of the same painter who painted Anne of Cleves. And Henry's 400 pounds at this point in the painting. So you can see how it could go either way. I don't know what Anne of Cleves looks like outside of this painting, but we are pretty sure Henry looks a little worse off for wear than this painting shows. So I thought that was interesting. So he annuls the marriage right away. And Anne is actually treated with great respect. She ends up with quite a bit of power anyway. She ends up in the court. She ends up having a voice. She becomes a political figure. She's treated very nicely. And the reason being is at this point in Henry's life, again, I was listening to what caused this to happen, how I found out some of this was thanks to social media. I was literally just scrolling as one does, but because I have spent so much time just listening to Henry VIII, and I've given you guys some of my other extracurricular interests. One of them years ago, I still have it, but one of them years ago was I was very into cooking, very into developing my skills as around the stove and the grill and so on. And so I still have some of that residual interest shows up on my social media. I get different recipes and different chefs show up. Well, one particular guy showed up on my recipe and Facebook's like, oh, you like recipes and cooking and you like Henry VIII. I'm going to put the two together for you. And so this guy showed up a couple of years ago. He had done a video. And one of his shticks is that he likes to make old recipes with the ingredients that they had available to them, with the tools that they had available to them. And he made a tart that was made for Henry VIII. And he said something like this tart by itself, this small tart was something like 4,000 calories. And he also said it was not very good. Well, he ate it. He's like, I've had worse. So, but I was like, wow, like a single dessert tart type thing was near 4,000 calories. And I was like, that's incredible. And he also talked about how every time Henry went somewhere, he had like 800 servants that would go with him, and they would bring all of their food and everything and just take over the kitchen because he had multiple palaces. So when he would show up, he would bring his entire cooking staff with him. And I was like, oh, this is super interesting. Anyway, he was fat. Anne of Cleves is that marriage is annulled. She's treated with great respect, but Cromwell, on the other hand, does not fare so well through this. He's actually executed for treason after this whole event. And so then I skipped a queen last week. I didn't know if anybody caught it. I caught it later. But Henry has 6 wives. We covered 5 of them. 3 of them are named Catherine, which is why I think I skipped her. Because then he marries Catherine, Queen of England, Catherine Howard. She's not super important to our story, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on her, just as a point of let's get to the next queen. But Catherine Howard was a bit promiscuous, I guess, before she married Henry VIII. And Henry didn't know that going into the marriage. She had at least 2 lovers prior to Henry VIII, and it was made known to Henry that she had lovers before the marriage, but he found out after the marriage. And because of that, he ends up having those 2 lovers killed, executed. And then he had Catherine Howard executed as well. And so then there again, he's without a wife. And then we get to his last wife, probably the most important to our story. Well, up there. We've got a few important wives, but this one being very important as well is Catherine Parr. Catherine Parr is his last wife, and she's a very intelligent woman. She's strongly in favor of the Protestant Reformation. And her and Cranmer are attempting to move the king in a more Protestant direction. But there were doctrines that the King of England wouldn't give up, one of them being transubstantiation and other things. So transubstantiation was a big deal, and Cranmer didn't believe in transubstantiation. He wanted to get that changed in the liturgy, and he was unable to because the King of England would not allow him to. And so we have 1547, Henry dies. So we have Henry dying in 1547 here, and his legitimate son from Jane Seymour is 9 years old, and he takes the throne. Now, that 9 years in which he's being raised, the majority of those 9 years, he's raised by Catherine Parr and Thomas Cranmer. And so you have the first English king raised exclusively with Protestant theology. And so we have a Protestant king take the throne. Oops, that's this slide. That's what that was supposed to show. So we have a Protestant king that takes the throne because of Catherine Parr and Thomas Cranmer. Jane had died. The other two wives didn't stay married to him long. So by the time Edward, I think, is 3 years old, is when Catherine Parr enters his life as his stepmother. So for the next 6 years between Cranmer and Parr, this is the king that they raise. Under Edward VI, a Protestant king, Cranmer's finally able to complete the work he wants to complete. And he completes this work in 1549, and this becomes the Book of Common Prayer. We talked about how our marriages today are basically identical to the layout of the marriage that's laid out in the Book of Common Prayer. All the special services are laid out, and so on. So the Book of Common Prayer, though, overnight, the Latin liturgy from the Church of England is removed and replaced with the Book of Common Prayer. The problem with that is that there were still a lot of people in the Church of England who were sympathizers towards the Catholic religion, to the Roman Church religion. They liked the Latin liturgy. They were used to the Latin liturgy, and now they're being forced. Well, they're not being forced. Now they're being told to change it, and they refuse to. They refuse to change it. They maintain the Latin liturgy in the Church of England, which forces Cranmer and Edward VI to create the Act of Uniformity. And that forces the Book of Common Prayer to be the only liturgy allowed in the Church of England. So now you're forced to use, because the Great Bible is compulsory, so no more Latin Vulgate. And now you have English liturgy. This is by force. And the problem with that is it raises a rebellion. This is called the Prayer Book Rebellion of 1549. The Prayer Book Rebellion of 1549. And this is particularly between Roman Church sympathizers who are still in the Anglican Church and the king's soldiers who are going to enforce the Act of Uniformity. And this rebellion broke out into open warfare. It's also called the Western Rebellion, I believe, because it takes place in Western England. But the Prayer Book Rebellion breaks out into open warfare, and it has a massive death toll of about 5,500 people, which is mostly on the rebel side, but this also includes the king's soldiers that had died as well. So Edward squashes the rebellion, and he evicts any other Roman Church sympathizers out of England, making it totally a Protestant country at this point. And so you end up with a safe haven for Protestants in the 1540s. So this landscape changes slightly throughout the 1540s, but an overall view of the 1540s, these are the three places you can go as a Protestant if you want to be safe. You can go to the King of England and Thomas Cranmer in England. You can go to Martin Luther and Philip Melanchthon in Saxony, which is modern day Germany. Or you could go to John Calvin or Henry Bullinger in Switzerland, and you could go to one of those three places. That's going to become important later, but during the 1540s, this is how that occurs. We talked about the Council of Trent, how they have to respond to all of this Protestant uprising. They meet regularly over the next 18 years to deal with different issues that are brought up by the Protestant Reformation. And then And primarily, the real outcome of that is that the Protestant Reformation is condemned as a whole as heretical, so that they can openly kill Protestants. Then we'll pick up here. Edward, at the age of 15, he gets sick with an illness that historians believe to be tuberculosis. He knows his time is coming at an end, but he has no heirs of his own. He's in the same situation his father was in, only much, much younger. He has no daughters. He has no sons. And in order to prevent the kingdom from falling into chaos, he has to pick a successor. And it is really important for him that the Protestant direction of England continue in that direction. He does not want it to move back towards a Roman Catholic position, and he doesn't even want it to go back towards the position his father had as the head of the Church of England. He wants a full Protestant. He wants the Protestant Reformation to remain in England under that authority. And so he looks around and he finds a first cousin. So he's not picking anyone even like immediately related to him. He finds a first cousin and he picks a girl, not a man. This was what Henry was worried about. Henry looked through history of English history, and every time a queen took the throne, the country ended up in some sort of civil war. And so that's why it was so important for him to get a male heir in order to maintain peace and unity in the country. Well, Edward picks a woman, and that woman is his first cousin, Lady Jane Grey. Lady Jane Grey replaces Edward on the throne, and this was not something she was expecting because she was not next in line to be in the throne. However, she was a staunch Protestant. She held the same views as Edward, and so this was a perfect pick for Edward for the throne in order to keep that theology in England. But if we remember, Catherine of Aragon, that was Henry's first wife. She gave him a daughter, never gave him a son. That daughter says, no way, we're not letting Lady Jane Grey take the throne. And so Mary the First, when she hears that Lady Jane Grey is going to take the throne, she raises up an army. She wins the favor of the court, and she usurps the throne. So Lady Jane Grey is queen for 9 days. She puts Lady Jane Grey on trial, and she is executed for treason. Her last words were, she recited Psalm 51, "Have mercy upon me, O God," in English. She asks the executioner the executioner asks her for forgiveness. And then she says, "Just dispatch me quickly." And he asks if he can lay her down for the beheading, and he refuses. And she kind of panics because she can't find the place because she's blindfolded. And she helps her find her way. And then she rests her head on the chopping block and she says, "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit." And so 16 years old, I got emotional while I was writing this, and I thought I got it all out then, but apparently not. 16 years old, she's executed. So Mary the First takes the throne. Excuse me. Mary the First takes the throne, and she is a staunch Catholic. She takes the throne by force, and she seeks to undo everything that Edward and Henry VIII did before her. So she submits herself to the Pope. It's the first thing she does. She's no longer the head of the Church of England. She submits herself to the Pope. She seeks to return the Church of England back to the control of the Roman Church. She burns all the English Bibles she can find. She brings the Latin Vulgate back into the English Church. Latin liturgy is brought back in. She removes the Act of Supremacy, which I already talked about. The Act of Uniformity she undoes, and the Book of Common Prayer she has removed. All of that is done. Having a Roman Church queen on the throne caused Protestants to flee from persecution, and she was gonna wage war on the Protestant Reformation. And so the very first person she targets is John Rogers. You guys remember who John Rogers is? John Rogers is the man who took William Tyndale's works with Miles Coverdale's work and combined them into what became the Matthew's Bible, which became the first legalized English Bible. John Rogers is the first one to be, I should say, first one to be executed, not the first one to be targeted, but he's the first one to be executed in this war against the Protestant Reformation. I'm going to read from Fox's Book of Martyrs, chapter 16, which recounts his execution. When the time came that he should be brought out of Newgate to Smithfield, the place of his execution, Mr. Woodroffe, one of the sheriffs, first came to Mr. Rogers and asked him if he would revoke his abominable doctrine, the evil opinion of the sacrament of the altar. Mr. Rogers answered, "That which I have preached, I will seal with my blood." Then Mr. Woodroffe said, "Thou art a heretic." Mr. Rogers replied, "That shall be known at the day of judgment." Mr. Woodroffe replied, "Well, I will never pray for thee." And Mr. Rogers said, "But I will pray for you." And John Rogers was the first of a massacre of about 300 Protestants who opposed the Roman Church. This massacre earned Mary the title of Bloody Mary. And so she is Bloody Mary in history. And while the death toll of someone like Edward VI is higher at 5,500, what seems to be the case, because I was like, why does Mary get Bloody Mary and Edward gets nothing? He killed 5,500 people. And it seems to be that it's the way in which the people died. Edward stopped a rebellion, and it caused a war and since it was a war, it was a war situation. Mary was hunting Protestants, taking them, torturing them, and burning them at the stake. And she does this through the major part of the latter part of her reign. And so day after day, we would find Protestants who would be condemned for heresy and burned at the stake. And Thomas Cranmer becomes one of the men who is targeted. This man was in favor of the Protestant Reformation, Book of Common Prayer, but more so, when Henry VIII wanted annulment from Catherine, and he couldn't get it from the Pope, and he signs the Act of Supremacy, it is Cranmer that executes the order for the annulment. And it is Cranmer that removes Catherine of Aragon and Mary from the palace and into the situation they were in. So she has a special hatred for Cranmer. The moment she takes the throne, Cranmer is thrown in prison and stripped of all of his authority and power. He's there for a couple of years, which is why Rogers ends up being executed first. He's there for a couple of years, and he is in prison with two other men. His two other men that are in there are Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley. They would have to wait a couple of years for their trial. In the meantime, Rogers is burned at the stake, so they know what is waiting for them. In October 16th of 1555, Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley are convicted and sentenced to be burned at the stake. And Hugh says to his brother in Christ, "Be of good cheer, Master Ridley, and play the man. We shall this day light a candle in England by God's grace that shall never be put out." And they were burned at the stake together. Cranmer was up next for his trial. He was convicted of heresy, and he did not deny it. Cranmer was moved out of the prison and into a university. And we think this was intended to, and he was treated as a guest there. This was intended to show him some kindness while he was being condemned of heresy. And this kindness was intended to soften him. This was a sort of what we might call, in a grand scheme of things, a good cop, bad cop situation. And so he was treated nicely at the university, and he knows if he continues this road, though, he's going to be burned at the stake. But he sees the benefits of maybe going a different way. And so it worked. Cranmer eventually signs recantations of all of Luther's and Zwingli's theology. He recognizes the Pope as the head of the church. He affirms transubstantiation, which he was opposed to before. And he affirms that there's no salvation outside of the Church of Rome. He announces his joy at returning to the Catholic faith and asked for and received sacramental absolution. And then he participated in the Mass. He goes full 180. Cranmer, though, I think under Henry VIII got accustomed to living a double life. Under Henry VIII, he was trying to move Henry VIII in a particular direction, but that forced him to affirm things he didn't affirm. Again, he's the Archbishop of all of the Church of England. So what he affirms, what he pushes down, is what all the churches are going to do beneath him. And so he's pushing down orders that he does not actually believe in. So he has this double life, a life that is going to save his neck from Henry VIII, so he doesn't oppose him too hard, and a life that says that's convicted by these acts, that he doesn't actually affirm these things. So throughout this year, March 1556, throughout the month of March specifically, Cranmer is asked repeatedly to recant this doctrine, recant that doctrine, recant this. And so he continually is signing recantations throughout March. His last one, the last one he signs, is on March 18th of this year. Mary hates him, and she's unsatisfied. There's laws against killing people who recant. And she's unsatisfied with his written recantations. So she demands one last one to be done publicly. And he is to address the public and recant to them openly of the heresy he held. They write the message for him, so it's scripted. And on that day, and they write it based on the recantations he had already signed. So it's not new recantations. And on March 21st, 3 days later after his last one, on March 21st, he stands at the pulpit, he opens with prayer and an exhortation to obey the king and the queen. But then he ends his sermon totally and unexpectedly, deviating from the prepared script, and he renounced all the recantations he had written or signed with his own hand, and then said, "And as for the Pope, I refuse him as Christ's enemy and Antichrist with all of his false doctrines." He's immediately removed from the pulpit, and he's brought to the same place Hugh and Latimer were burned. And only 6 months earlier, and as the flames drew up around him, he thrusts his right hand into the fire, calling it that unworthy hand in which he signed the documents of recantation. And then he says his last words, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. I see the heavens open and Jesus standing at the right hand of God." And so I underestimated a little bit how long I was going to take. But what we'll talk about next week, Robert Estienne, also known as Robert Stephanus, Erasmus's protege and architect of the standardized Bible. And we'll get the next chapter of how we received our Bibles next week. You all are dismissed. Thank you.